Section 38 of the World's Best Orations, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. Thomas F. Bayard, 1828 to 1898. In 1876, when the country was in imminent danger of the renewal of civil war as a result of the contested presidential election, the conservative element of the Democratic Party, advised by Mr. Tilden himself, determined to avoid anything which might result in extreme measures. The masses of the people were excited as they had not been since the close of the Civil War, and the great majority of the Democrats of the country were undoubtedly opposed to making concessions. Thomas F. Bayard, who took the lead in the Senate as the representative of the moderate policy favored by Mr. Tilden, met the reproaches sure to be visited in such cases on the peacemaker. Nevertheless, he advocated the Electoral Commission as a method of settling the contest, and his speech in supporting it without doubt one of the best, as it was certainly the most important of his life, paved the way for the final adoption of the bill. It is no more than justice to say that the speech is worthy of the dignity of that great occasion. Mr. Bayard inherited the equable temperament shown by his father and his grandfather. He was a warm-hearted man with a long memory for services done him, but he had a faculty of containing himself which few men exercised to the degree that he exercised it habitually, both in his public and private life. The habit was so strong, in fact, that he indulged only on rare occasions that emotion which is necessary for the highest success as an orator. The calmness of his thought shows itself in logic which, while it may invite confidence, does not compel admiration. When he is moved, however, the freedom of his utterances from exaggeration and from that tendency to rant which mars many orations makes such periods as those with which he closes his speech on the electoral bill models of expression for all who wish to realize the highest possibilities of cumulative force. The son of one United States Senator, James A. Bayard of Delaware, and the grandson of another, Mr. Bayard represented well the family tradition of integrity. Born in 1828, he succeeded to his father's place in the Senate when 41 years of age, and remained in the public service until within a short time of his death. He was Secretary of State under the first Cleveland administration and ambassador to England under the second. In the convention which nominated Mr. Cleveland in 1884, Mr. Bayard, who had been strongly supported for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1880, was so close to the presidency at the beginning of the balloting that his managers confidently expected his success. He became much attached to President Cleveland, and in 1896 he took a course on the financial issue then uppermost, which alienated many of his friends, as far as friends could be alienated by the political action of a man whose public and private life were so full of dignity, simplicity, and the qualities which result from habitual good faith. Mr. Bayard survived almost into the 20th century as a last representative of the colonial gentlemen who debated the federal Constitution. Supposed to be cold and unapproachable, he was really warm in his friendships, with a memory which never allowed an act of service done him to escape it. Few better men have had anything to do with the politics of the second half of the century. He died in 1898. W.V.B. A Plea for Conciliation in 1876. Counting the electoral votes, United States Senate, January 24, 1877. Mr. President, I might have been content as a friend of this measure to allow it to go before the Senate and the country, unaccompanied by any remarks of mine, had it not been the pleasure of the Senate to assign me as one of the minority in this chamber to a place upon the select committee appointed for the purpose of reporting a bill intended to meet the exigencies of the hour in relation to the electoral votes. There is for every man in a matter of such gravity his own measure of responsibility, and that measure I desire to assume. Nothing less important than the decision into whose hands the entire executive power of this government shall be vested in the next 4 years is embraced in the provisions of this bill. The election for president and vice president has been held, but as to the results of that election, the two great political parties of the country stand opposed in serious controversy. Each party claims success for its candidate and insists that he and he alone shall be declared by the two houses of Congress entitled to exercise the executive power of this government for the next 4 years. The canvass was prolonged and unprecedented in its excitement and even bitterness. The period of advocacy of either candidate has passed, and the time for judgment has almost come. How shall we who purpose to make laws for others do better than to exhibit our own reverence for law and set the example here of subordination to the spirit of law? It cannot be disguised that an issue has been sought, if not actually raised in this country, between a settlement of this great question by sheer force and arbitrary exercise of power, or by the peaceful, orderly, permanent methods of law and reason. Ours is, as we are wont to boast, a government of laws and not of will, and we must not permit it to pass away from us by changing its nature. Oh, yet a nobler task awaits thy hand, for what can war but endless war still breed? By this measure now before the Senate, it is proposed to have a peaceful conquest over partisan animosity and lawless action, to procure a settlement grounded on reason and justice, and not upon force. Therefore, it is meant to lift this great question of determining who has been lawfully elected president and vice president of these United States out of the possibility of popular broils and tumult, and elevate it with all dignity to the higher atmosphere of legal and judicial decision. In such a spirit, I desire to approach the consideration of the subject, and shall seek to deal with it at least worthily, with a sense of public duty unobstructed, I trust, by prejudice or party animosity. The truth of Lord Bacon's aphorism that great empire and little minds go ill together should warn us now against the obtrusion of narrow or technical views in adjusting such a question and at such a time in our country's history. Mr. President, from the very commencement of the attempt to form the government under which we live, the apportionment of power in the executive branch and the means of choosing the chief magistrate have been the subject of the greatest difficulty. Those who founded this government and preceded us in its control had felt the hand of kingly power, and it was from the abuse of executive power that they dreaded the worst results. Therefore, it was that when the Constitution came to be framed, that was the point upon which they met and upon which they parted, less able to agree than upon almost all others combined. A glance at the history of the convention that met at Philadelphia on the 14th of May, 1787, but did not organize until the 25th day of the same month, will show that 3 days after the convention assembled, two plans of a constitution were presented, respectively, by Mr. Edmund Randolph of Virginia and Mr. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. The first proposed the election of the executive by the legislature, as the two houses were then termed, for a term of 7 years with ineligibility for re-election. The other proposed an election, but left the power to elect or the term of office in blank. Both of these features in the schemes proposed came up early for consideration, and as I have said before, as the grave and able minds of that day approached this subject, they were unable to agree, and accordingly, from time to time, the question was postponed and no advance whatever made in the settlement of the question. Indeed, so vital and wide was the difference that each attempt made during the course of the 5 months in which that convention was assembled only seemed to result in renewed failure. So it stood until the 4th day of September had arrived. The labors of the convention by that time had resulted in the framing of a constitution, wise and good and fairly balanced, calculated to preserve power sufficient in the government, and yet leaving that individual freedom and liberty essential for the protection of the states and their citizens. Then it was that this question, so long postponed, came up for consideration and had to be decided. As it was decided then, it appears in the Constitution as submitted to the states in 1787. But an amendment of the second article was proposed in 1804, which, meeting the approval of the states, became part of the Constitution. I must be pardoned if I repeat something of what has proceeded in this debate by way of citation from the Constitution of the United States, in order that we may find there our warrant for the present measure. There were difficulties of which these fathers of our government were thoroughly conscious. The very difficulties that surround the question today are suggested in the debates of 1800, in which the history of double returns is foretold by Mr. Pinckney in his objections to the measure then before the Senate. The very title of that act, a bill prescribing a mode of deciding disputed elections of President and Vice President of the United States, will show the difficulties which they then perceived and of which they felt the future was to be so full. They made the attempt in 1800 to meet those difficulties. They did not succeed. Again and again the question came before them. In 1824, a second attempt was made at legislation. It met the approval of the Senate. It seemed to meet the approval of the Committee on the Judiciary of the House, by whom it was reported without amendment, but never was acted upon in that body and failed to become a law. This all shows to us that there has been a postponement from generation to generation of a subject of great difficulty that we of today are called upon to meet under the circumstances of peculiar and additional disadvantage. For while in the Convention of 1787 there was a difference arising from interest, from all the infinite variances of prejudice and opinion upon subjects of local, geographical, and pecuniary interest, and making mutual concessions and patriotic considerations necessary at all times, yet they were spared the most dangerous of all feelings under which our country has suffered of late. For amid all the perturbing causes to interfere with and distract their counsels, partisan animosity was at least unknown. There was in that day no such thing as political party in the United States. Then none were for a party, but all were for the state. Political parties were formed afterward and have grown in strength since, and today the troubles that afflict our country chiefly may be said to arise from the dangerous excess of party feeling in our councils. But I propose to refer to the condition of the law and the Constitution as we now find it. The second article of the first section of the Constitution provides for the vesting of the executive power in the president and also for the election of a vice president. First, it provides that each state shall, through its legislature, appoint the number of electors to which it is entitled, which shall be the number of its representatives in Congress and its senators combined. The power there is to the state to appoint. The grant is as complete and perfect that the state shall have that power, as is another clause of the Constitution, giving to each state the power to be represented by the senators in the branch of Congress. There is given to the electors prescribed duties, which I will read. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president, one of whom, at least, shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots the person voted for as vice president, and they shall make distinct lists of all persons voted for as president and of all persons voted for as vice president, and of the number of votes for each, which lists they shall sign and certify and transmit sealed to the seat of government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. Then follows the duty and power of Congress in connection with this subject to determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. The next clause provides for the qualifications of the candidates for the presidency and vice presidency. The next clause gives power to the Congress of the United States to provide for filling the office of president and vice president in the event of the death, resignation, or inability of the incumbents to vest the powers and duties of the said office. The other clause empowers Congress thus to designate a temporary president. The other clauses simply relate to the compensation of the president and the oath he shall take to perform the duties of the office. Connected with that delegation of power is to be considered the 8th section of the first article, which gives to the Congress of the United States power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. It will be observed so far that the Constitution has provided the power, but has not provided the regulations for carrying that power into effect. The Supreme Court of the United States 60-odd years ago defined so well the character of that power and the method of its use that I will quote it from the first volume of Wheaton's Reports, page 326. Leaving it to the legislature from time to time to adopt its own means to effectuate, legitimate, and mold and model the exercise of its powers as its own wisdom and public interest should require. In less than 4 years, in March 1792, after the first Congress had assembled, there was legislation upon this subject, carrying into execution the power vested by the second article of the Constitution in a manner which will leave no doubt of what the men of that day believed was competent and proper. Here let me advert to that authority which must ever attach to the contemporaneous exposition of historical events. The men who sat in the Congress of 1792 had many of them been members of the convention that framed the federal Constitution. All were its contemporaries, and closely were they considering with masterminds the consequences of that work. Not only may we gather from the manner in which they treated this subject when they legislated upon it in 1792 what were their views of the powers of Congress on the subject of where the power was lodged and what was the proper measure of its exercise, but we can gather equally well from the inchoate and imperfect legislation of 1800 what those men also thought of their power over this subject, because, although differing as to details, there were certain conceded facts as to jurisdiction quite as emphatically expressed as if their propositions had been enacted into law. Likewise, in 1824, the same instruction is afforded. If we find the Senate of the United States without division pass bills which, although not passed by the coordinate branch of Congress, are received by them and reported back from the proper committees after examination and without amendment to the committee of the whole House, we may learn with equal authority that what was conceded by those houses as to the question of power over the subject, in a compilation made at the present session by order of the House Committee, coordinate with the Senate Committee, will be found at page 129, a debate containing expressions by the leading men of both parties in 1857 of the lawfulness of the exercise of the legislative power of Congress over this subject. I venture to read here from the remarks of Mr. Hunter of Virginia, one of the most respected and conservative minds of his day in the Congress of the United States. The Constitution evidently contemplated a provision to be made by law to regulate the details and the mode of counting the votes for President and Vice President of the United States. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. By whom and how to be counted, the Constitution does not say. But Congress has power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. Congress, therefore, has the power to regulate by law the details of the mode in which the votes are to be counted. As yet, no such law has been found necessary. The cases, happily, have been rare in which difficulties have occurred in the count of the electoral votes. All difficulties of this sort have been managed heretofore by the consent of the two houses, a consent either implied at the time or declared by joint resolutions adopted by the houses on the recommendation of the joint committee, which is usually raised to prescribe the mode in which the count is to be made. In the absence of law, the will of the two houses thus declared has prescribed the rule under which the President of the Senate and the tellers have acted. It was by this authority, as I understand it, that the President of the Senate acted yesterday. The joint resolution of the two houses prescribed the mode in which the tellers were to make the count, and also required him to declare the result, which he did. It was under the authority, therefore, and by the direction of the two houses that he acted. The resolutions by which the authority was given were according to unbroken usage and established precedent. Mr. President, the debate from which I have read took place in 1857 and was long and able, the question there arising upon the proposed rejection of the vote of the state of Wisconsin because of the delay of a single day in the meeting of the electors. A violent snowstorm having prevented the election on the 3rd of December, it was held on the 4th, which was clearly in violation of the law of Congress passed in pursuance of the Constitution, requiring that the votes for the electors should be cast on the same day throughout the Union. That debate will disclose the fact that the danger then became more and more realized of leaving this question unsettled as to who should determine whether the electoral votes of a state should be received or rejected when the two houses of Congress should differ upon that subject. There was no arbiter between them. This newfangled idea of the present hour, that the presiding officer of the Senate should decide that question between the two disagreeing houses, had not yet been discovered in the fertility of political invention, or born perhaps of party necessity. The question has challenged all along through our country's history the ablest minds of the country, but at last we have reached a point when under increased difficulties we are bound to settle it. It arose in 1817 in the case of the state of Indiana, the question being whether Indiana was a state in the Union at the time of the casting of her vote. The two houses disagreed upon the subject, but by a joint resolution, which clearly assumed the power of controlling the subject, as the vote of Indiana did not, if cast either way, control the election, the difficulty was tided over by an arrangement for that time and that occasion only. In 1820, the case of the state of Missouri arose and contained the same question. There again came the difficulty when the genius and patriotism of Henry Clay were brought into requisition and a joint resolution introduced by him and adopted by both houses was productive of a satisfactory solution for the time being. The remedy was merely palliative. The permanent character of the difficulty was confessed, and the fact that it was only a postponement to men of a future generation of a question still unsettled. It is not necessary, and would be fatiguing to the Senate and to myself, to give anything like a sketch of the debate which followed, of the able and eminent men on both sides who considered the question, arriving, however, at one admitted conclusion, that the remedy was needed and that it did lie in the law-making power of the government to furnish it. Thus, Mr. President, the unbroken line of precedent, the history of the usage of this government from 1789 at the first election of president and vice president until 1873, when the last count of electoral votes was made for the same offices, exhibits this fact, that the control of the count of the electoral votes, the ascertainment and declaration of the persons who were elected president and vice president, has been under the coordinate power of the two houses of Congress, and under no other power at any time or in any instance. The claim is now gravely made for the first time in 1877 that in the event of disagreement of the two houses, the power to count the electoral votes and decide upon their validity under the Constitution and law is vested in a single individual, an appointee of one of the houses of Congress, the presiding officer of the Senate. In the event of a disagreement between the two houses, we are now told, he is to assume the power in his sole discretion to count the vote, to ascertain and declare what persons have been elected. And this, too, in the face of an act of Congress passed in 1792, unrepealed, always recognized, followed in every election from the time it was passed until the present day. Section 5 of the Act of 1792 declares that Congress shall be in session on the second Wednesday in February 1793, and on the second Wednesday in February succeeding every meeting of the electors, and said certificates, or so many of them as shall have been received, shall then be opened, the votes counted, and the persons who shall fill the offices of president and vice president ascertained and declared agreeably to the Constitution. Let it be noted that the words President of the Senate nowhere occur in the section. But we are now told that though Congress shall be in session, that though these two great bodies duly organized, each with its presiding officer, accompanied by all its other officers, shall meet to perform the duty of ascertaining and declaring the true result of the action of the electoral colleges, and what persons are entitled to these high executive offices, in case they shall not agree in their decisions, there shall be interposed the power of the presiding officer of one of the houses to control the judgment of either and become the arbiter between them. Why, Mr. President, how such a claim can be supposed to rest upon authority is more than I can imagine. It is against all history. It is against the meaning of laws. It is not consistent with the language of the Constitution. It is in the clearest violation of the whole scheme of this popular government of ours, that one man should assume a power in regard to which the convention hung for months undecided, and carefully and grudgingly bestowing that power even when they finally disposed of it. Why, sir, a short review of history will clearly show how it was that the presiding officer of the Senate became even the custodian of the certificates of the electors. On the 4th of September, 1787, when approaching the close of their labors, the convention discovered that they must remove this obstacle, and they must come to an agreement in regard to the deposit of this grave power. When they were scrupulously considering that no undue grant of power should be made to either branch of Congress, and when no one dreamed of putting it in the power of a single hand, the proposition was made by Honorable Mr. Brearley from a committee of 11 of alterations in the former schemes of the convention, which embraced this subject. It provided 5. Each state shall appoint in such manner as its legislature may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and members of the House of Representatives to which the state may be entitled in the legislature. 6. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, one of whom at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves, and they shall make a list of all the persons voted for, and of the number of the votes for each, which list they shall sign and certify, and transmit sealed to the seat of the general government, directed to the President of the Senate. 7. The President of the Senate shall, in that House, open all the certificates, and the votes shall be then and there counted. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the President, if such number shall be a majority of the whole number of the electors appointed. And if there be more than one who have such majority and have an equal number of votes, then the Senate shall choose by ballot one of them for president. But if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the Senate shall choose by ballot the president. And in every case after the choice of the president, the person having the greatest number of votes shall be vice president. But if there should remain 2 or more who shall equal votes, the Senate shall choose from them the vice president. See Madison Papers, page 506, etc. Here we discover the reason why the President of the Senate was made the custodian of these certificates. It was because in that plan of the Constitution, the Senate was to count the votes alone. The House was not to be present, and in case there was a tie or failure to find a majority, the Senate was to elect the president and vice president. The presiding officer of the body that was to count the votes alone, of the body that alone was to elect the president in default of a majority, the presiding officer of that body was naturally the proper person to hold the certificates until the Senate should do its duty. It might as well be said that because certificates and papers of various kinds are directed to the president of this Senate to be laid before the Senate, that he should have the control to enact those propositions into law, as to say that because the certificates of these votes were handed to him, he should have the right to count them and ascertain and declare what persons had been chosen president and vice president of the United States. But the scheme reported by Mr. Brearley met with no favor. In the first place, it was moved and seconded to insert the words "in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives" after the word "counted." That was passed in the affirmative. Next, it was moved to strike out the words "the Senate shall immediately choose by ballot" and insert the words "and House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot, one of them for president, and the members of each state shall have one vote," and this was adopted by 10 states in the affirmative to 1 state in the negative. End of section 38.